on this computer. There we go. Alrighty, we are officially recording. So welcome everybody to the Florida Society for Ethical Ecotourism Education webinar series. This series will be put on by Florida Sea Grant agents like myself the second Wednesday of every month from 7 to 8 p.m. for the rest of the year, actually through December. This is the first of the events of the series this year, and today's topic will be Seagrass Ecology. After every webinar, we're going to send out an evaluation that is not about you. It's about to help us better understand how we can improve our programming. And then, of course, you know, having feedback helps us to continue to justify these educational programs that we provide. As I mentioned at the very beginning, for those of you who joined early in particular, we are recording this. And we do ask that if you are currently watching on YouTube or watch at a later date, that you also visit that survey that I mentioned using the link in the description, or there's also a QR code in the slide deck. So if I've done my calculations right, this presentation should be about 45 minutes with some time for question and answer at the end. My colleague, Carolyn, who has her camera on, is going to wave. We'll be moderating the chat box and we'll interject if you guys have any technical difficulties or it's a question that, you know, we feel like will really benefit everybody else in the group. But we're going to try to hold most of those questions for the end. So I think we've covered some housekeeping stuff. Now, please forgive me as I try to share my screen. Okay. I am screen sharing. How are we doing? Can everybody see everything? Perfect. I see a thumbs up from Carolyn. So yes, today I mentioned, as I mentioned, this first talk is going to be about seagrass ecology and why we care about seagrasses in our state and how we can responsibly recreate in them. I would be remiss, though, if I didn't, mention the hosting agency of these webinars, which is the Florida Society for Ethical Ecotourism. We had a lot of registrants today, and so for those of you who aren't familiar with Florida Sea, you might hear me refer to it as that or see it abbreviated as FLSEE in this presentation. Florida Sea was established in 1998. Following a meeting of ecotour operators to establish and maintain a professional code of ecotourism ethics in order to encourage awareness and stewardship of Florida's natural heritage. So what the heck does that mean to you, for you guys that are here? Florida Sea has, and that should be capitalized F, Florida S, capital E, has this certification process that benefits ecotourists, people who want to go on those tours, as well as ecotour operators. So businesses or organizations that participate with the organization that are in good standing, you can buy yourself an annual membership that it comes with various levels and pricing plans. But this certification as well helps those businesses that are participating receive additional support through the organization of Florida Sea. They provide resources and additional opportunity for promotion through their networks. And then, of course, creating that peer network for organizations to connect with one another and be able to share best practices. It also makes it easy for responsible ecotourists to target experiences that align with their values. So you can actually visit the Florida Sea website right now and look up a list of certified ecotour operators if you're interested in engaging in ecotourism. And then, of course, the organization provides ecotourism, additional education opportunities, lots of E-words today. Provides educational opportunities like the one that you guys are currently at. And I mentioned Florida Sea Grant as well. So I don't know if I actually introduced myself yet. I'm Kate Rose. I am the Florida Sea Grant Extension Agent in Charlotte County, Florida. So I'm based kind of just south of Tampa there. And I share my seat on the Florida Sea Board with Carolyn Kovach, who has her camera on today and will be helping me moderate the webinar today. And also with Michael Sipos, who is the agent in Collier County. And I'm not sure that I mentioned that Carolyn is the agent in Flagler and Volusia counties, both too. I often like to discuss provide a little background on what Florida Sea Grant is either. When I first told my grandmother about this position, she thought I was going to be a secret agent. So I always like to start with a background. And Florida Sea Grant is a part of the land grant university sort of system, actually, which was established in 1862, actually by Abraham Lincoln, who realized that there was a disconnect between the agricultural research that was occurring at the university levels and the end users, who at that time were the farmers that were producing our the country's food supply. So it was very important, and he established this system to make sure that that research was getting to the end users where it could benefit everybody. So he designated one university in every state as the land grant university, whose job it was to do that extra step of extension and outreach. Of course, in the state of Florida, that college is the University of Florida, specifically the Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. And then in 1975, somebody said, hey, maybe we should also do that for our aquatic resources. And thus Sea Grant was born. So Sea Grant is actually housed under NOAA. And there is a Sea Grant program in all 35 coastal states, the Great Lakes states, Puerto Rico, and Guam. I have to add Guam onto this slide. And as I mentioned, I am also the Charlotte County Sea Grant agent in Florida. The way that we break that up is we are affiliated with counties. So I work with a lot of people and hopefully continue to be a resource for you guys and additional parties. And because we're affiliated with the University of Florida, we have to show this slide that says that the University of Florida will not discriminate against anybody for any reason. And if you would like to lodge a complaint, I can provide that information to you. But let's get to the fun stuff. That being said, I realize I threw a lot of words at you on this slide, but I think it really speaks to how much information there is on how important seagrasses are to our coastal environments, to our environments as a whole. So there was this big report that came out of the University of Florida Department of Soil and Water Sciences that roughly estimated that in the early 2000s, so a little bit of a lag there, as there sometimes is with science, that seagrasses contributed $180 billion annually to the state's economy between the benefits that it has on recreational and commercial fishing, as well as nutrient cycling and promoting aquaculture. So I'll just walk you through these statistics here. The services that seagrass provides, of course, it's a really vital habitat. More than 70% of all commercial and recreational species in Florida depend on seagrass meadows at some points in their lifetime. And I say more than 70% because I've seen 70% circulate a lot, but I've also seen reports that suggest that that number goes up to 90 or 95%. And according to the Smithsonian Marine Station at Fort Pierce, 1 acre of seagrass can sustain upwards of 40,000 fish and 50 million invertebrates. So I teach a course here in Charlotte County, as many other sea grant agents do, called the Florida Master Naturalist course. And we actually went seining, basically dragging a net through the seagrass. And my students were just shocked. You know, we must have dragged that net 30 feet. And they were like, there are so many animals in here. So it's really, really critical habitat. And because it's critical habitat, it's also a really important food supply because it hosts all of those small, tiny animals that form the basis of our food chain. Plus, the seagrasses themselves serve as a food source. I think we've all probably heard of manatees and turtles munching on the grass. Seagrasses also improve water quality. So 1 acre of successfully restored seagrass can provide a value of about $3,500 in nitrogen removal. Which is a huge, which is a driver of marine algal blooms. So something we're really interested in. They also filter the water they also filter diseases out of the water. There was a study done in 2017 that suggested that when coral reefs are in proximity to seagrass beds, there seems to be less coral and fish disease on those reefs when they just exist compared to when they just exist in isolation. Seagrass is also a carbon sink. They hold 336 metric tons of carbon per square kilometer. which is, sorry, moving a few graphics around here, but compared to, your average terrestrial forest, which holds 121 metric tons of carbon. So I often get the question, I often like to say that seagrass to me is the unsung heroes of the ocean. We hear a lot about coral reefs, we hear a lot about our Amazon rainforest, but they're doing a lot of great things. And then on top of that, they also provide a huge value in their shoreline stabilization with their root systems, preventing shoreline erosion, particularly during storm events. Okay, so have I convinced you? Oops. So have I convinced you that seagrasses are important? I feel like I've been talking about it for a while. And the reason that I have to harp on it so much is because, unfortunately, we are losing our seagrasses around the world at a fairly drastic rate. So these figures are from a really monumental study in the seagrass biology field, where the authors looked at all of the seagrass studies that have ever been done and basically looked at areas where seagrass was declining, which is in red. You can see there's a lot of red in both of these figures, unfortunately, where there's no detectable change and where the seagrass is increasing. So you can see the sheer amount of red on this map. And the study was ultimately able to conclude that seagrass coverage around the world is declining at a rate of about 7% per year. So pretty drastically, we're losing this really crucial resource. And unfortunately, here in Florida, we are not immune to that. So I have included just a few examples here. This is something that we are seeing, a phenomenon that we're seeing all over Florida. I tried to pick an example from the East Coast and the West Coast, and most people would gravitate towards Tampa Bay as a story for seagrass loss, but being in Charlotte Harbor, I'm very familiar with the issues here that we've had here. And you can see from this map, from the Coastal and Heartland National Estuary Partnership Water Atlas, that we have experienced almost a 23% loss between 2018 and 2022 in Charlotte Harbor, which is pretty drastic. I mean, and that's an average. So some areas of the harbor lost 50% of their seagrass. So very quick degradation. On the East Coast, I have to imagine that people are familiar with the status of the Indian River Lagoon. I think it was probably this time about a year and a half ago that we were seeing stories about FWC having to go out and hand feed manatees because there was an algal bloom that wiped out the seagrass over there, and their food sources were severely limited. So FWC had to take up that role. On a side note, I believe they're actually trying to wane the manatees off the seagrass now, or off the romaine lettuce now, and are not having success. What a job, though. Unfortunate that it's necessary, but what a job. So why are we losing seagrass loss? Unfortunately, there's not one silver bullet that we can just sort of address. As with all sort of complex and large scale issues, it's multifaceted. So seagrass is a plant. It's actually really structurally really similar to like a house plant, which has roots and needs light to survive. So when you get increasing turbidity from these rain events that we're having, like one that we're currently having right now, if you're viewing from the Florida Peninsula, particularly in the Southwest region, when we get these rain events, it washes off there is runoff that clouds the water and prevents light from accessing the seagrass, which is the condition that it best thrives in. With sort of that increasing cloudiness in the water also comes a nutrient input. And that nutrient input fuels algal growth. Algae is just so much more efficient at taking up nutrients than seagrass is. So when there's an excess of algal growth or an excess of nutrients, algae will actually grow over the seagrass. And I've heard it compared to putting a tarp on your lawn and expecting it to grow. Boat propeller scars. So you can see this image here. It's actually a really zoomed out image that was taken with from a plane. And you can see, if you look closely, sort of these hairline, these thin lines across this seagrass meadow. But if you were to zoom in and get really close to that, this just shows you the frequency with which propeller scars are occurring. So boats that are running too shallow and their propellers are spinning really fast and cutting up the seagrass. I mean, much like a lawnmower. So you can see the scale at which that is occurring and why it could be really drastic. But if you zoomed in, those scars are actually much wider than they look in this picture. Increasing temperatures, with global climate change, much the way you don't like it when it gets hotter outside, the seagrasses also have a specific range that they thrive in, so that heat really stresses them out. Salinity variation, like I mentioned, as rain patterns sort of shift and our weather gets a little wonky with climate change, seagrasses are getting pulses of fresh water and salt water at times that they're not necessarily used to, and they're happening really quickly, so there's not a lot of time for the seagrass to adjust. There are diseases out there. Seagrass wasting disease was one that was very prominent, particularly in Florida Bay in the 80s, and again, sort of in the early aughts. And changing sediment conditions. So seagrasses do so much as far as locking down tons of sediment in their root systems. And if anybody has played in a seagrass field and you take a big handful of that muck, it smells terrible, right? Because there's a lot of anoxic conditions, and those conditions can go from just okay enough for seagrass to exist to absolutely toxic for seagrass. We sort of saw a cascading effect of that in Florida Bay, this combination of disease and the changing sediment conditions that made things really hostile for seagrass. So what can you do about it as an ecotourist and as an ecotour operator? So the first thing you could do is implement seagrass safe boating practices. So you can avoid seagrass beds and utilize navigational channels. If you do find yourself in a shallow area, make sure you trim that motor up so that the propeller isn't cutting the tops of the blades, or even further down the seagrass rhizomes, their sort of root system. And if you do find yourself in a moment where you find yourself stranded, don't try to motor yourself out of it. Get out and just give yourself a push to save that seagrass. So using a GPS, a depth finder, and wearing polarized sunglasses can all help you from running aground. For those of you who don't know, polarized sunglasses, just the way that the light and the physics of the lenses work, they allow you to see through the water more clearly than glasses that aren't polarized. So you'll be able to see those seagrass beds in addition to using some of those tools like a GPS and a depth finder. And of course, this is good for the environment and the longevity of your boat. Nobody wants to run aground. Be mindful of your anchor when you are out and about. So if you want to recreate in these seagrass beds and you see a sandy patch, that would be a really good place to anchor. If you're fortunate enough to visit an area where the seagrass is so lush and you can't find a sandy patch, it's important to set your anchor gently and drive towards your anchor as you're pulling it in. You don't want to pull on that anchor and have it scoop up seagrass with it. So you can either dislodge it manually and hop back in the boat, depending on safety conditions, of course, or you can make sure that you're driving towards it so that you're not pulling sideways on the seagrass, that the anchor will just lift right up. And if you're swimming in the seagrass, and this also applies to springs as well, because there are freshwater species of seagrass, don't pull on it. Don't use it to pull yourself around. Don't use it to hold yourself stable. If you're kayaking in a shallow area, if you're trying to hold up for your friend, it's a really fragile plant. We don't want to use it as, a handle. So another dynamic that is contributing to seagrass loss is something that's just a little bit more insidious. And it's this relationship between seagrass and seaweed. So you've heard me talk a little bit about algae. I might have said the words macroalgae. That just means algae big enough that we can hold in our hand. You would probably know it as seaweed. It's that icky stuff that touches your foot when you're swimming. And there's this dynamic between seagrass and seaweed where in a system that has very little nutrients in it, seagrass tends to dominate and macroalgae can't exist. Like I said, it's so efficient at taking that up, it just needs it instantaneously. But there are a lot of places in the state of Florida where our waters are starting to become very nutrient rich. And we're starting to see this shift from a seagrass dominated system to one that is dominated by macroalgae or seaweed. And as time goes on, the more and more nutrients you put into it, then it will even evolve from a macroalgae, so seaweed, dominated system to a microalgae dominated system. And that's where you get into, the things like your red tide, your microcystis, your things that are like even less fun to deal with, and that seaweed touching your foot. So that algae, you guys, some of you might have seen it. I mean, some of you might have seen it. We've got all different types of species. We've got green algae. This is some caulerpa here, some brown algae. It looks like some red algae, Acanthophora. Some of you might be looking at this going, it all looks brown. Yes, that is true. Algae is pretty hard to identify, but there are little tips and tricks that if you stick around long enough, you figure it out. And there's also cyanobacteria, which a lot of fishermen sort of colloquially refer to as snotgrass. Anybody who fishes over seagrass beds knows that when you cast your line and you reel it in and there's a bunch of that cyanobacteria, when you pull it up, it's just this big slimy mess of cyanobacteria. It's not microcystis. It's not the big scary one that is toxic, not necessarily always, but when it grows in colonies like this, it can still sort of have that same effect as the seaweed or the macroalgae and blocking out all of the light for the seagrass. So monitoring is a really important aspect of documenting the health of these vital systems and also tracking restoration progress, because that is something that we're actively trying to do, is put the grass back into these systems. So as far as the monitoring efforts that exist, come on, here we go. So seagrass monitoring efforts are mapped by the water management districts every 2 to 3 years by plane. So they sort of get a big macro lens of where the seagrass starts and stops. And then the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, often the aquatic preserves specifically, get in the water and sort of validate that data by physically looking at the seagrass on a smaller level. And here you can see a map of all of the sites that the Charlotte Harbor Aquatic Preserves teams check for that ground truthing effort. As far as who's managing algae, since that seems to be a really big driver of seagrass loss in the state, there are annual surveys in Charlotte Harbor that started, I think around 2020, I believe. 2020, 2021, everything got a little dicey there around COVID. And then once the Florida Wildlife Research Institute, which is the research arm of FWC, started seeing this algae, they started making note of it on their regular surveys. But you'll notice that there's not this development of algae is sort of a new phenomenon. And for that reason, there's not a lot of concentrated research efforts on it yet. Enter Eyes on Seagrass. So Eyes on Seagrass is a citizen science or participatory science program that was started by my predecessor here in Charlotte Harbor and that I now run. And actually, there are many efforts in which we have involved citizen scientists to monitor seagrass around the state. The Sea Grant agent in Escambia County actually started monitoring seagrasses in collaboration with the University of West Florida in 2017. That program then expanded to Santa Rosa County. As I mentioned, we here in Charlotte County developed the moniker of Eyes on Seagrass. The Sarasota Bay Estuary Program then took the efforts that we created by talking with University of Florida researchers and taking the methods that were used by actual scientists and just simplifying them ever so slightly so that we can engage our communities and get more eyes on the seagrass. So the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program took on our methods in 2021, and we're actually in collaboration currently to expand into Lee County thanks to the Colusa Waterkeeper Ranger Program, which we're very excited about. The Tampa Bay the eyes on seagrass methods were actually utilized in Tampa Bay following the Piney Point wastewater spill to sort of do a rapid assessment of the ecosystem and the impacts to that wastewater spill. It was a method that was easy enough for folks to do quickly and safely. We've also had interest from the Nature Coast and the Big Bend in their aquatic preserves. And we're sort of in some very loose conversations right now about whether or not there are restoration applications, which is a really big focus for the Indian River Lagoon right now as they try to restore their seagrass populations. So I like to think of eyes on seagrass as sort of a there's two main goals. So the first goal is to increase scientific impact. And the way that we do that is we actually go out at different times of year than state agencies are currently going out. For example, in Charlotte Harbor, the state agency monitoring occurs in the late summer, sort of at seagrass peak growth. But we send out our volunteers in the spring and sort of in the early summer, which are times that are ecologically significant for algae. So it kind of gives us a before and an after shot of that algae bloom so we can hone in and be an additional resource of tracking that algae. So between all of the programs that I just showed you on the previous slide, we have been monitoring 150 sites for a minimum of 4 years. So 4 years accounts for the Charlotte Harbor program. As I mentioned, the Panhandle program has been running since 2017, but 150 sites that we've been covering, and we visit them more than once per year. In Charlotte Harbor, we visit ours twice per year. In the Panhandle program, they visit theirs monthly between April and November. And the data that our citizen scientists are collecting have been presented at local, state, and national conferences as well. And we try to make them accessible to natural resource managers so that they can better make decisions to help manage this really vital ecosystem. And literally, I think this time next week, I'm actually starting my travels tomorrow. I'll be traveling to Italy to present our data at the International Seagrass Biology Workshop. So really making headway there and getting, proving how valuable citizen science and community engagement can be. Which brings me to our second prong. Our second goal is stewardship. So our volunteer time and resources, all the way back from 2017 until now, are valued at just under $1 million. We get about 3,000 volunteer hours per year throughout the whole state. You do this brief calculation with this value of a volunteer hour, and you get a really impressive number. Particularly when you're in the scientific community, you're talking about writing grants to get money for restoration or for continued monitoring and to do things in that system. So we have this really great available resource in this volunteer base. And on top of that, we're really creating environmental stewards. We really strive to create a community amongst our volunteers. All the pictures on the right here are pictures from the Charlotte Harbor Seagrass, Eyes on Seagrass Volunteer Appreciation Banquet. If that's not a mouthful, I don't know what is. And you can tell all of our volunteers are really enjoying themselves. They get a free meal, they get some swag. And that has longer lasting effects than them just like having fun and engaging with their ecosystem. So we surveyed our 2023 volunteers 6 months after their first surveys, and 91% of them had implemented at least one behavior change beyond just participating in the program to improve the environment for seagrass. So for some of them, that meant trying to use less fertilizer on their lawn, investigating Florida-friendly landscaping practices. For others, it meant consciously employing some of those seagrass-safe boating procedures that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. And some of them, it meant just talking to friends and family or advocating for seagrass conservation in a political habitat, in a political setting. This is another one of my favorite statistics that comes from the program that I think really speaks to volunteer engagement and enjoyment. So following Hurricane Ian, which was pretty traumatic for, I think all of us all over the state, not just in Southwest Florida, I was approached by a University of Florida researcher who was trying to understand the environmental impact of Ian as soon as we could justify, checking it out and making sure that human, life and property was safe. And so they said, can we get the Eyes on Seagrass volunteers in the water? And I was like, we don't even know if it's safe to swim yet. Like, we didn't even know as the scientists, we didn't know the answer to that. And so I sent out a survey to my volunteers and I said, do y'all be willing to get in the water? Like, let me figure out if I even have a volunteer force here. And 82% of them said that they were willing to hop in after Ian. I'm not even sure I would have been willing to get in the water. So I think that really speaks to people's dedication and how engaging with this resource makes them really connected to understanding what's going on. So why am I talking about this program? We're talking about the Florida Society for Ethical Ecotourism. I would propose not only that seagrass meadows warrant some best practices for protection and recreating in them, but that this program, Eyes on Seagrass, is a really good voluntourism opportunity. So the way that the program works is we provide training, the necessary training, and all of the equipment that one would need to monitor seagrass and follow this scientifically valid procedure that we have developed. So we're going to give you all the equipment, which includes a bunch of field guides on identifying seagrass, identifying algae, and following that procedure through and being able to really get to know your environment. Then we are going to provide the training, of course, and we ask volunteers to provide their own transportation to their assigned site, which they could do via boat, kayak, canoe, stand-up paddleboard, or we even have some wading sites available, snorkeling equipment. And we always say responsible boating equipment. So always a good thing to bring your sunscreen and your water and any swimming aids that you might need. We ask that they survey their sites during the designated period, which in the southwest of Florida, we allow volunteers 2 weeks to visit their sites. They can visit their sites anytime during those 2 weeks, whatever fits their schedule. They only have to visit each site once. And then return the data sheet and the equipment once you're done. And the reason that I say that this makes the ultimate voluntourism opportunity is because of the varying levels of participation and the accessibility of it. So you can see here from this picture on the left, this is a picture of one of our volunteers completing her survey with her kids. They brought their pool noodles, they brought their, I don't know if I'm seeing sunglasses or snorkels, but she was able to expose her kids not only to swimming around in the ocean because it's fun, but also that sort of extra step of why do we care about this and why are we looking at it? And here are some extra dynamics that you might not have been aware of before, which are really in line with ecotourism, ethical ecotourism principles. And on top of that, you're not just looking at the seagrass. I mean, this is a picture of one of our volunteers saw a manatee while they were out. We have many volunteers that, they've seen birds, stingrays, sharks, but I promise they're not scary for those of you who are nervous about sharks. We love to see them. So they're seeing a lot of biodiversity in these systems as well and engaging with them in a really meaningful way that sort of drives home their importance. And I also think it provides an opportunity potentially for ecotourism operators to get involved if they were so interested. There are lots of business models that have employed using volunteers to recruit people to their organization. The Coral Restoration Foundation is one, which I assume Carolyn will touch upon in her coral lecture a couple months down the line here. But there's an opportunity for ecotourism operators to get involved. This procedure that we do, as I mentioned, it's simplified, but still scientifically rigorous to help your customers feel like they're really making a difference and they're doing an activity with you that's really meaningful. As you can see from this sort of outline of the procedure, what we do is we string out a line effectively, and at various points along that line, we stop and we collect the same information. So this provides scientific rigor, but it also makes the procedure repeatable enough that it provides a good sense of ethos within the people that are doing it. Even if you don't know quite what you're doing at the very beginning because you've forgotten everything that you learned from training, by the time you get to the end, you figure out what's going on. So it's really easy to implement. And on top of that, I lied. I'm going to pause on that thought. But we see an opportunity for ecotourism operators to get involved and fill in some of the gaps that we're asking the volunteers to do. So, for example, providing transportation. I know we have, part of some members of the Florida Society for Ethical Ecotourism, members that have that certification are boats for hire. So you could provide that transportation via kayak, boat, or waiting at your park. Providing that responsible boating equipment, which you guys are likely already doing if you're providing that transportation out on the water. Surveying your assigned sites during the designated period. We have strived to create a model that isn't so restrictive that it can only be done at this time of year. So hopefully it could potentially fit into your business model and potentially, provide a fun and engaging special for customers. And all we need back from you when you're done is a snapshot of that data sheet. If we can read everything on it, you're good to go. And the reason I've started the equipment, this is where my brain went earlier before I got sidetracked. And the reason I put a little asterisk by that equipment is based on where you're located and where the programs are running, we provide the equipment, and I'm sure we would be program coordinators would be willing to provide that equipment to those businesses. But if you were so interested, if you take a look at that equipment, it's nothing more than some PVC pieces and some buckets. So even if you felt inclined to, take this upon yourself and incorporate it into eco tours, if we could get the data, that would be amazing and a marketing opportunity for you as well, if you were so interested. So, opportunities for getting involved, if you so wish, keeping our eyes on the future. So as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, the counties that are currently running Eyes on Seagrass in the state are Charlotte, Sarasota, Lee, Escambia, and Santa Rosa. And here you have all of the contact information for the coordinators that are running those programs. If you want to get in contact with them, pardon me. The counties in Southwest Florida, so being Sarasota, Charlotte, and Lee counties, actually have an upcoming sampling window available. If you wanted to participate, maybe try it out as a volunteer and see if it's something that you feel like you can apply to your business, or act as an eco-tourist yourself. So that 2-week sampling window that I mentioned will actually occur from July 22nd to August 5th. Like I said, you can go anytime during that period. And in Charlotte County, we will be hosting our training on July 20th. I decided not to include that on the slide since the Sarasota County and the Lee County programs might have some different training opportunities that don't coincide with ours. Those counties in the Panhandle, if you are in that region of Florida, their sampling window, they have their volunteers sampling monthly right now, between April and November. And you are welcome to reach out to Rick or Thomas to get involved with that if you were so interested. Oh boy, we did it, folks. We made it to the end of the presentation. So if you remember nothing else, you can remember my email at the bottom of the screen if you were so interested in getting involved with a program, either as an ecotourist or an ecotour operator. And if you remember anything else, hopefully you do remember that seagrasses are vitally important to Florida's ecosystems, our water quality, and our economy. You can conserve seagrasses by implementing, seagrass safe boating practices. So making sure not to create propeller scars, using troll motors when you can. Participating in Eyes on Seagrass is a fun way to engage with and protect your local environment. Like I said, an eco tour opportunity that also does some good and makes people feel really excited about their involvement in the program. And keep your eyes on opportunities to engage in ethical ecotourism with Florida Sea Grant, as well as the Florida Society for Ethical Ecotourism. So that being said, I'm going to bring up that survey again, that we would be really appreciative of everybody who is on this, who's on this webinar right now, could either scan this QR code, or I think Carolyn is going to put the link in the chat as well. That helps us with our reporting and continue to justify our involvement in the great work that we've been doing with the Florida Society for Ethical Ecotourism. And at this point, I'll be taking questions, but since people tend to log off, I just wanted to remind everybody that our next webinar will actually be hosted by Mike Sipos, the Sea Grant Extension Agent in Collier County, and it will be on invasive species in Florida. So thank you all for attending. I'm going to leave this slide up for as long as I can while we take any questions. Anything meaty there, Carolyn?
No, we had a pretty quiet chat here. Kate, did you pause the recording?
Great point.
So we have a couple of questions popping through now. First of which is, when is the next seminar? I will pull that up right now.
I believe it is July